Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good
Hey,
morning.
George.
Hello, we're on sides.
We're the wrong way around. I can fix it. You watch this. I'll fix it. You watch this. I can fix that. Hang on. You ready? Bump. Bump. Ha 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 ha. I'm back in the power position. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I finally got a good night's sleep. And I don't feel like I'm living in a surrealist artwork anymore.
Right. Very good. Now, we've got a lot going on today, and actually some conversations that we've already had with people that we're going to play to you today. So if you are watching and if you are spending time with us, really keen to get your thoughts around what you're watching today, because we are going to talk to Reverend Frank Ritchie about Easter. Really, my kind of thoughts around Easter are: why are we celebrating? What is it about? You know, what is it in popular culture today? What do we think of it? And then we're talking to Siouxsie Wiles about the current orange alert level that we've just been put under. And then after that, George, you're going to have to introduce our last guest. Do you want to tell us who it's going to be?
Yeah, we'll be talking to journalist Gabriel Gavin about basically the death of the International Space Station and the end of an era when it comes to US-Russia cooperation in space.
Yeah. So three conversations for you. So when I said, if you're watching, happy for you to participate and jump in. The way to do it today is with chats. And if you chat with us and it becomes something that we can just kind of put out there whilst the conversations, the pre-recorded conversation, we'll just put it over the screen. So if you've got an interesting thing you want to add, so the first conversation is going to be about how is Easter relevant to Western culture in 2022. That's really what it's about, beyond a public holiday. And then after that, Susie, and then after that, Gabriel Gavin. Gabriel Gavin. So we're gonna just get into it this morning because Gabriel. Yeah, actually, did you ask him that? Is it Gabriel or Gabrielle?
Gabriel.
Gabrielle has got like two L's and an E, I think, maybe. Yeah. So it's Gabriel. All right. Gabriel. Apologies if you're watching Gabriel. Now what's happened? Did you know me? My dyslexic brain's going to hold on to one of those no matter what from here on. And I don't know which one it's going to be. So we'll figure out what's going to happen. Okay, so I'm a good mate of a guy called Frank Ritchie, Reverend Francis Ritchie, who I've known for a very long time, nigh on 20 years. He is someone who is a media chaplain. So he is kind of, you think about a chaplain, I think about chaplains and I think about schools. You know, schools have chapels, it feels like to me, and the chaplain is like the priest or the minister or the whatever who runs that. He calls himself, and he is a media chaplain. So what he is basically is, I don't know, spiritual advisor, is that the right word? But to the media. So if someone in the media wants to talk or wants to share or needs some help or needs a comment, then Frank is the guy that comes on board and does it. So he's perfect for us to talk to about what is Easter, what is it all about, what is it in 2022 for a Western New Zealand civilization. And let's just jump straight into that conversation, shall we? If I can find my mouse. There's my mouse. We'll jump into that conversation now. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Pat.
You very well? You good? You with me?
I am well. Always lovely to hang out with you, my friend. I'm liking how your background has changed since we last caught up. I like that rustic wood look.
What was it doing last time? Was I up in my bedroom last time?
Yeah, you're in your bedroom and you had like changing neon light behind you.
Oh, the porn star lights above my bed.
Yeah. That one. Yeah, whereas I'm going for the he's a brain box look with my background.
That's what we've got. Yeah, I was also looking there, my little name there, right, and your little name by yours. It just says Frank. It doesn't say Reverend Frank. So I probably should do a proper introduction. Media chaplain, Reverend Francis Ritchie. And as you say, brain box around all things religion. Is that a fair introduction?
Oh, yeah, probably. I mean, fair. I don't know if I'm so much of a brain box. I like to give the impression that I am, and then I just talk and see what happens.
Yeah. I like talking about Easter, and that's why we've got you on. It's the appropriate time to talk about Easter. I remember, as I'm saying that, I remember hearing a story from Stephen Merchant, comedian and co-creator of The Office, talking about how he apparently had quite a religious sister and he was an atheist, and they were arguing when they got together for, it was probably Christmas, about religion, and his mother went, "Oh, look, this is not the time nor the place to argue about religion," and he was like, "Hang on, this is exactly the time and the place because it's a religious holiday." So I kind of feel like it's exactly the time and the place that we should be talking about Easter, because tomorrow is an Easter holiday. So that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's a time when I get my most requests for comment as well. So yeah, I think most people are onto that trip. That if you're going to talk about it, now is the time.
because it's different from Christmas, eh? And obviously, I don't want people to go, "Oh, yeah, of course it is." But what I'm saying is, Christmas is steeped in religion, i.e., within this Western culture, the celebration of Christmas is a Christian origin story that then has flowed into Frosty and Santa and other things as well. But this one is different. It feels different, and it is different because whilst it's got those same historical contexts for a Western world, I reckon if you lined up 100 people and asked them about the origin story or what of Christmas, many of them would say the baby in the manger. Maybe not all of them, but many of them. I think far fewer would say this dude Jesus and died on the cross and that kind of stuff for Easter, in my opinion. I mean, I guess you're steeped in this stuff and work around this stuff. Would you assess the same?
Yeah, it's because of my world, it's really hard to know how much the average person who doesn't consider themselves Christian, hasn't grown up around church, how much they actually know about this time of year. But I mean, I have a sense that this time of year is very different. It comes, whilst there's still commercialism there, it comes with less commercial traps than Christmas does. It doesn't come with our end of year wind up and our planning of our summer holidays in Aotearoa. And I think there's a sense of somberness around it that doesn't come with Christmas because we're dealing with the death of Jesus. And a lot of people probably know the crucifixion element, might not necessarily know the resurrection element because that's slightly more awkward to talk about.
To package in an egg form. I was thinking about also how the culture thinks of Easter. And I made a thumbnail for yesterday's episode. So let me show you the thumbnail. This is for the episode we're doing right now. You may or may not have seen the thumbnail, but the thumbnail looks like this, right? It's for today's episode. So these are the things we're going to talk about today. And obviously there's this picture here of old JC on the cross. So I went to Google Images or whatever it was, Bing Images, and went and I just typed the word Easter. That was it. That was all I typed looking for it. And here's an example of, I did it again this morning. It's not quite the same because I did it on my laptop upstairs, and obviously there's different caching and that kind of stuff. When I did it upstairs, I had to scroll through about 9 pages before I got to anything to do with a religious holiday. And as I was doing that, I kind of went, oh, that's really interesting. It's not quite the same today. It's a different search in a different computer, but you can still see going through all of these, like there's one there, right? But then actually there's very little. I mean, Easter Island is in there quite a lot, but not that Easter story. Even Trump gets a mention, and Pence gets a mention on the Easter search. But you can see, I mean, look, there's another one there, but that's actually, people might also be looking for the actual Easter search. And I guess that kind of speaks to me a little bit of, I mean, let's be honest, it'll be steeped in American bias, this, because that's where a lot of these images and stuff come from. But it doesn't seem to be relevant, let's say, to your average person when they're thinking about Easter. I think that would be echoed in mostly when you do a search for an image, you get the most popular that pop to the top, and old JC's not up there.
Are you able to do
interesting observation?
Are you able to do that search live, just out of interest? Because I'd like you to look up how the way that most of the world actually refers to this time of year, because it's only English-speaking countries that call it Easter. So I want you to look up Pascha, Pascha, and let's see what images come out when you look that up.
Okay, and we go to images. Lots of food. There's actually eggs there. Lots of food.
But one of the first is the Eastern Orthodox icon of the resurrection.
Oh, here is it this?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So different imagery.
Shirts there. Yeah.
Well, so most of the Most of the world calls it Pascha. It's
Really?
just coming out of Old English, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. We call it Easter, rolling off Bede, who was a missionary in England in like 700 odd AD, referring to the month that they were celebrating Pascha in. And he posited the idea, he's the only one that's ever written about it, that that month might have been named after an old fertility goddess named Ilsta. And so therefore we get, in English-speaking countries, we get Easter, and we get that confusion around the fact that we might be just following some pagan tradition. Most of the world calls it Pascha, and then you get a very different look as to what that is.
When you say most of the world, I mean, I think English is the second largest. I think Mandarin might be the largest language, and then English might be the second largest. But you say most of the world, that would imply to me at least the second largest language, English, would call it Easter. I mean, there's not English-speaking countries that call it Pascha, are there? Or are you saying they do?
Well, there's a lot of countries that speak English as a second language. So you've got your Commonwealth countries that would refer to it as Easter, but outside of that, so in much of Europe and Russia, it would be called something along the lines of Pascha or some variation of that, and therefore a familiarity with the story of this time of year is a whole lot higher because it hasn't been muddied with these other stories and these other ideas.
That's really interesting. I never knew that. So are you saying in all other countries that aren't dominant in English, like whether it's France or Belgium or Germany or Russia or Japan, or it's more likely to be Pascha?
Yeah, I think with probably the exception in that list of Germany, who I think name it after a fertility goddess that they celebrate as well. Ostra, I think her name is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think Germany would be the exception there. But outside of Germany, it would have some name that links it more closely to Passover, since that's what we're most connected to in the Jewish calendar.
Wow. Well, there you go. The books behind you have served themselves well today, because it's brand new information, and that's brand. Like, I grew up in the Catholic Church, right? So I have had this story around me since I literally couldn't talk, and I've never heard that explanation before. So that's something.
I actually think the church would do itself a great service if in English-speaking countries now, thinking about secular New Zealand, if we moved more and more to using that term, Pascha, just to highlight the difference and to somewhat separate it from some of the mythology around some of the other things that people think it's connected to when it isn't. I think using Pascha would connect it more clearly to the Jewish Passover.
Right. The celebration, although that's a strange word to think about someone being kind of put to death, but the celebration of Easter for the Christian world is, I'm going to say it's obvious. As I said, grew up in the Catholic Church, so I understand, the celebration of it, which is this figurehead of your religion kind of did his biggest deed. Sort of the reason he was here, that was about Easter. I'm paraphrasing very poorly, and you can put it in your words if you want. But I'm also wondering about Easter for the non-religious. Like, I think it's quite easy to attach Christmas to the non-religious, because like you're saying, there's family, there's summer holidays in New Zealand, there's the end of your work year, there's recuperation from a busy, there's lots of things you can attach to it. And I remember a friend of mine talking about, what better than to sell it, like talking about this kind of idea about it's a religious holiday. And a friend of both of ours, said to me once, imagine if this figure here, this God character, what better would he want than a whole group of people having a big party at the end of the year and getting back with their families? That'll be a great thing. I'm trying to relate that to Easter and the non-religious, other than a few days off work. What's in it for them? What can they get from it or from the story, do you think?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of reflective elements in there. So even if you don't believe the story, those reflective elements involve suffering. They involve loss of hope, a sense that things are really dark. When I think about, particularly, you've got Jesus on the cross and his sense of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Are words that he says when he's on the cross, mirroring a really old psalm, a really old poem that was core to their DNA and the prayers that he would have been praying. So you've got the disciples their hopes, their dreams, and their expectations about who Jesus was and what they thought he was going to achieve. And then when you think about the crucifixion, then what we call Easter Saturday, that time after all their hopes and their dreams, their expectations have come crashing down. So there's this sense in the Christian story that God dives into the middle of that with humanity, that he enters into that darkness. But there's an acknowledgement of suffering there. Christmas doesn't have that acknowledgement. And in the middle of a pandemic, I think something like the acknowledgement of human suffering is really relevant. And we're not a culture that does great at allowing room for suffering and allowing it to breathe. We kind of want to hush it away. We want to silence it. We want to make it better as quickly as we possibly can. Whereas what we call the Easter story allows room for that. And it says that's part of the human experience. It's within the human DNA to a degree to suffer. And so we have that there in the story. What the slightly uncomfortable story of the resurrection does, which is what most secular people would reject, is it says that God is interested in life in the midst of suffering, that even when things seem really hopeless, even when things seem really dark, there's always a way back. As long as we're breathing, there is a way forward. And it causes us to check our expectations. And the beauty of the resurrection is it says that life can be better than what we had hoped for. So that story through darkness and through suffering into life and into light, I think, is relevant for everybody. And the story gives us a chance, whether you believe it or not, to reflect on that. In the Northern Hemisphere, of course, and this is where people marry all these things together as well, it sits in springtime. So you get that darkness to light going on in a way that we don't in the natural world here in the Southern Hemisphere.
No, and as it gets darker and darker here in Dunedin, I'm feeling your pain. Hey, Frank, it's been great to talk to you today. I thank you for bringing a bit of context to it. I do often think about, we do have holidays in New Zealand, and we know exactly why and where they've come from, whether it be Anzac Day, whether it be Waitangi Day, whether it be fucking Labor Day. We have these days that we go, this is why it's here, and this is why. Doesn't mean you have to agree with Waitangi Day or Labor Day or Queen's birthday if you're not someone who's into the monarch. But it seems that this, and probably Christmas as well, but more so, this is the one that people just literally think of it as a day off work for a day off work. And as you said, whether they agree or believe with the story that's being told, I think it's important for people to know why the story is there and why the days are being had off, even if it's not part of their calendar or our calendar in a modern New Zealand. There's a historical context as to why these days are here, and I just wanted to share that a bit today, I guess.
Yeah. Can I just add one more point?
Sure.
Pat? I think too, it's this story more than the Christmas story that has fed into some of the values that we hold as dear in Western society that has been influenced by Christianity. Obviously, some of that influence has been bad. I'll own that straight up. But some of the ways that this story has influenced us in really good ways is our understandings of humility, of self-sacrifice, of the ideas of our leaders needing to be people who serve first and foremost. And this comes with, this time of year comes with the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. There's an element where we expect that sort of humility, or we want it from our leaders, and they do their best to show that they embody that, whether they do or not. So there's a chance here to celebrate some key values about who we are as well, and to remind ourselves about the values of things like humility and service.
Excellent. Reverend Frank, do you still go by Francis? I know I ask you this every time, but have you gone back to when you became a reverend to start off with? I think you were trying to be a bit more formal with the Francis. Have you officially dropped that yet? Are you Reverend Frank Ritchie now, or do you go back to Francis? How am I saying goodbye to you today, Frank?
Oh, because of the radio years, mate. Frank Ritchie just stuck, but I do like Francis. I mean, named after a great saint who embodied humility and service. So I'll happily go with either. Stage name is Frank, but intimately Francis.
Yeah, I don't know how intimate we're going to be this morning, but there you go. I also was going to say, and I didn't say it at the time, Bede is my middle name. So I'm
very good. Well, this time of year is perfect for you then. He's part of the reason everybody gets confused about the whole fertility goddess thing.
Yeah. Because he was a bit of a dog? No, just kidding what we're talking about. No. Hey, Frank Ritchie, Reverend Francis Ritchie, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your perspective, and have an amazing Easter.
Thanks, Pat.
Booyah, back again. I just wanted to share, there's a really, I think it's really funny, a really funny message that's come in from Emperor. Says, obviously Emperor's watching, he or she, I'm not sure which one, but did a search on that word, Pashka, whatever it is. But the first 2 images I got were about Germany's 12-level Pashka brothel going out broke. Then I get the Holy Week religious imagery, which I think is kind of hilarious. So it's funny. I often think about what you get. I don't know if you've ever done this, but or seen this. There's videos on YouTube from like, 2 famous people will sit down and Google themselves as a part of a Vanity Fair kind of thing, and some of the things that they ask, like, is such and such real, and that kind of thing. It's pretty funny. It's always a bit funny when you look at what's come up. Anything you want?
We're obsessed with wanting to know if things are real. Right?
Yeah.
I loved the conversation, Pat, because I am a strong sort of, I guess it's probably the anti-capitalist in me, or the anti-consumer culture in me, that's sort of like, we have totally sucked the soul out of these spiritual days in terms of secularizing them. And I liked that, Frank sort of noted the stories that can be told and the values that can be celebrated. I also think it's just a real epic story, right? This dude like sacrificing himself on the cross. Like, that I'd rather celebrate that than chocolate eggs, although I do have a nicely sized chocolate egg waiting for me when I see fit. So yeah, no, totally in agreement, and totally, I mean, these, I think we've had this conversation with Matariki, right? I think these days are more than just the sort of some sort of calculation of, can we afford a day off and all these sorts of things, right? They're more than just these secular breaks in our work life. They're more than that. They can be spiritual holidays. They can be times to reflect on values such as sacrifice. And also for some people, they're deeply personal religious times,
Yeah, and I also, it's a little bit like, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse here with saying this like 3 days in a row. One other thing here from Emperor, when Emperor searched the word Easter, had crucifixion and religious images, then loads of bunnies and eggs, both searches on work computers. Probably depends on your cache and stuff as well as what you have been searching recently. I don't mean to say this 3 episodes in a row, but the whole idea of leading a horse to water, educating people without sounding patronizing, saying we've got all the answers. It's like, why do we celebrate this day? Why are we going to celebrate Matariki? Why do we, what's the origins of Christmas Day? And why is it in our calendar? And it's not in our calendar because of Santa. It's in our calendar because of the Christian origins and religious origins of hundreds of years ago in Western civilization and culture. And it's okay. I'm actually doing a podcast later on today, which I'll upload tomorrow to my the DOCNZ page. It'll be on the same YouTube channel if you want to follow us, with a pastor or Anglican, I don't know what the official title is, reverend or minister. And there was a very good clip with Paul Henry several years ago when he was in breakfast having an argument with a I don't know, maybe a secularist about, the secularist was arguing we shouldn't be teaching Easter in schools. And he was going, well, of course you should be, not as a point of conversion to people. And she was like, why? And he went, because it's Easter, like just making it really clear that it's okay to go, this is why the holiday's there, not to go, so now you should all get down on your face before this, this flying spaghetti monster and give that, it wasn't about that. It was like, he was really quite adamant that this is the story of this holiday. So we should be teaching the story of why this holiday's there. And I'll talk to his name's Spanky Moore later this afternoon about that.
And the meanings around holidays can change. Like, it is a contested space, right? And
of course,
and that's why Anzac Day can be an opportunity to critique continued war around the world, right? Or question the political decisions or so forth that were made in the past. Same with Waitangi Day as well.
Yeah. But it doesn't, and that doesn't, therefore, if it evolves and changes and a society decides that it's going to be different, that therefore doesn't mean, so let's ignore why it was here to start off with. You can still teach the historical aspect of that. And so I think around religion and stuff, people get a little bit antsy, like we can't mention religion. Although not to get on the kind of boomer bandwagon, but if it's a story about Ramadan, about a non-Christian religion, schools and curriculums do seem much more open, and people who are fighting against teaching about like what Easter is do seem much more open to being accurate and clear as to why that holiday is happening there. Maybe because it doesn't impact the culture they live in, like it's not like something that's forced upon them, it's something from a different country. But it is interesting where that seems to be a common theme amongst people are keeping religion out of schools. And I'm not actually fighting for religion in schools, that actually teaching and educating the children as to why this one happens and this one happens and this one happens is fine, but Easter, no, we did not do Easter. So
I guess sometimes those other ones are sort of like exoticized in a way, right? And whereas Easter has been completely destroyed by consumer culture.
Well, and probably, I mean, we think about America when I say this, but probably, people, let's just talk about a 35-year-old woman in America who wants to get an abortion. For her, probably the Christian religion, based on their laws and based on their history, might feel quite oppressive, and to her personally, but teaching about Ramadan, that doesn't impact her and her life at all. So I get why, but I guess what I'm saying is let's be consistent. I mean, we're not talking about converting children, but we're talking about purely, educating why this day is here based on these historical reasons. I think that's completely appropriate.
Yeah. And I mean, it's totally appropriate. Like, I guess in New Zealand, after 51 worshippers were killed, it's appropriate to sort of understand the Islamic religion. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
We should keep moving because or else we're going to be here until 12:30 and we've all got busy days. Because we're going to move straight into now a conversation with Siouxsie Wiles. Siouxsie Wiles is a microbiologist and, of course, very high profile in New Zealand media as speaking about COVID in particular, but various, I guess, things that microbiologists talk about. Had a chance to catch up with her just before 10 o'clock. So let's fire that out there now. And again, if you want to participate and join in, you're welcome to send a chat through, and if we can use it during the conversation, we'll put it up. But let's go to my conversation with Siouxsie Wiles. And welcome to the show, Siouxsie Wiles. Siouxsie, thanks for giving us some New Zealander of the Year. I don't think I've said that since the award actually happened, Siouxsie Wiles. Thanks for joining us, mate.
Oh, thank you. Not the current New Zealander of the Year. We obviously have a new one now.
But what happens? Do you have to give your crown back at the end of the year? How does that work?
There was no crown. And I'm reliably told we remain, of the alumni.
As a side note, I mean, I don't know if you've done this personally, but some people put that kind of thing on their CV or on their email signature or whatever. Is it the kind of thing that people leave in there now, or does it have to be like former New Zealander of the Year?
No, you put the year that you were New Zealander of the Year, I think.
Very cool. Very cool. I mean, congratulations for that whole thing anyway. But anyway, let's get on to the news from yesterday that the government has decided to move to orange with the COVID outbreak. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit at some stage about us here in the Deep South and where we're at versus other parts of the country, because I'm a bit disappointed that the whole country's gone to orange.
Yeah.
But you're the expert. I'm just the bullhead with a microphone. So tell us your thoughts at the moment about New Zealand going to orange yesterday.
Yeah, look, so our outbreak as a whole is definitely cases are dropping and hospitalizations are dropping, but we know that different places are at slightly different, different places in their outbreak. So Auckland and many other places have peaked and are coming down, but as you say, down south, that's not the case. And in fact, possibly not even having reached the peak yet. So it really doesn't seem the right time to have made that call. And I did see some messages on social media from one of the district health boards down there, basically saying, please be careful. Cases are rising. Our hospitals are really stretched. So it does seem a decision that's been about the Easter holidays, about hospitality, about all of the people who are pressuring to have this kind of idea of getting back to normal and living with COVID. And actually this is living with COVID, right? We've got a new infectious disease that's here. And we don't live with it by ignoring it, right? We actually live with it by having appropriate public health, protections in place. And so I think it should have been, different levels for different parts of the country.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, Siouxsie, but what I hear you saying is that there's politics involved in this, not just good public health measure. Now, I don't know if you can actually say that from your position, but that's what I hear when you say that.
Look, it's really clear that the government have to take in, or they do take in, many, many different, positions when making their decisions, right? So they've got public health giving them advice. They've got, they've got active lobbying through the media and through, we've seen, how many stories have we seen from hospitality saying, get rid of all restrictions, right? Or other groups. So they are obviously balancing a lot of different requirements. Or a lot of different needs, a lot of different voices. It's not, I'm really glad I don't have to make those decisions, right? Because what I'm thinking of is public health. I'm thinking of the impact of the virus. And I'm really thinking about the long-term impact of the virus, right? I don't think we are talking about that enough. There's a huge amount of uncertainty at the moment, right? We know from the previous bits of the pandemic that there are people who, even if they get a mild infection, will go on to have some, symptoms that for some people are lasting, a couple of years after they have been infected, right? And so, this idea of long COVID, of people having, chronic fatigue, of people having an impact on their hearts, on their brains, we don't know how much that will happen to people who've had Omicron and how much that will happen to people who've been vaccinated. And so we're still in this really uncertain phase where I would like us to be being more cautious, because this is likely, globally, to be one of the most disabling things that the world has ever experienced. And we're kind of like storing up problems for the next 5, 10, 20 years. The sheer number of people who've been infected now, but in New Zealand, but globally, even if just 1% of those people end up with chronic fatigue and can no longer work, that's a massive impact, globally, on productivity, on people's lives and livelihoods. We need to talk about that, and we need to plan for it.
Yeah, I'm as you're talking, I always go, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this one? So I'll see if I can follow all my train through, because the first thing I thought was the research that I've read just as a consumer of content and then passing it on with no expertise about the number of mild cases moving into long COVID is one of those things. I wanted to show people, if they're not quite aware around the country, what we're talking about when it comes to the South. This is an article from yesterday's ODT talking about we're having spikes at the moment in Dunedin. We're currently in the Southern DHB have, I think we're 7% of the population, but we have over 12% of the cases. So when I look at those numbers, I kind of go, I really would have personally liked to have seen, so like my 15-year-old's at school today, and I know that there's going to be pressure at school today from some of the people going, well, why the fuck are you wearing masks? We don't have to wear masks anymore. Why are you wearing a mask? And I'm like, so I just said to her today, look, I almost was like, take a day off school. You can take a day off, it's fine, but I didn't. But I'm like, the holidays are at the end of today. Even if they had have done 11:59 tonight, I was like, that would have been something that would have given, I think, some places a bit more of a break. But here's something else that I saw. I don't know. I'm assuming Sci Time with Tracy. You've seen the TikTok Sci Time with Tracy. She's a scientist out of America who's been talking about COVID. She got a lot of profile for doing it. She put this up the other day. This is just talking to the overall issue. This is a screenshot that I took from her TikTok. Now, this strikes home close to me because my father in 1948 caught polio, right? So I'm with it on polio. This is the numbers that she's put out, and she's got citations and links to all of these things, because we all think about things like polio and stuff being terrible and being, being a really bad disease. So if you can't quite see it, I'll read it to people if you're watching on a smaller device. This is of 10,000 infected people, right? Of those 10,000 infected people, asymptomatic and polio was 7,000. It's 4,000 for COVID. Mild symptoms were 2,400. It's 4,800 for COVID. Severe symptoms was 500 for polio, 840 for COVID. Critical disease with 50 for polio, 300 for COVID. Fatalities with 10 for polio, 120 for COVID, and post-infection syndrome, which is the long COVID that we're talking about, was 20 for polio and over 1,500 for COVID. Now, those numbers might be slightly different in the US. Obviously, they've got a different system and stuff. But that I see that kind of stuff and I go, orange for a few more weeks, another week, a little bit longer, just to let the peak, for example, in Southern to pass away would have been much what I preferred.
Same. Same. You know, and I think the other thing that's been really unhelpful has been people not really understanding why it's important to keep masks in some contexts, even when it's okay to go and, you know, be dancing on a dance floor without a mask on, right? Because there are people who we know are going to be, you know, who are more vulnerable to having a serious infection. And so they're, you know, they're not going to be going to a dance floor, but they are going to need to go to the supermarket. They are going to need to go, you know, shopping, and they should be able to do those things more safely. And so the reason, the way we make that safer is by everybody wearing a mask, right? Because if you're the person who was out dancing and you have got COVID and you don't yet realize it, well, you know, then you're going to be infectious, and wearing a mask will help reduce the amount of virus that you're putting in the air. So I think you know, the cons on this have been terrible.
Scientists shocked.
People saying, I don't understand. Why can we do this really high risk thing, but this thing that seems to me really low risk? It's like, well, risk's not the same for everybody. And as we've moved into this this new kind of scenario, which is everybody's supposed to make up their own mind about how much risk they're either at or how much risk they're willing to take. Well, not every, you know, there's going to be people who are high risk and who you know, they need to do these things, right? And so that's kind of what I want to see. Is I want to see much more of an appreciation and an understanding that when we talk about individual risk, actually that's a really hard thing, because we are making things more risky for some people. And there are ways to make those environments safer by all of us doing something simple like wearing a mask.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that was one of my questions. Here's the article I brought up to ask you about it, because it did seem a bit silly. But as you explain it, you know, all the 20-year-olds at the nightclub is very different from the 80-year-olds at the supermarket. You kind of go, okay, there's I can see what there is behind it. Hey, I wanted to ask you another question, because your profile in this world is pretty high. I mean, there's you and there's Michael Baker seem to be the two of the people that the media speaks to a lot. I think also that I guess what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to think of a way to say to ask this that doesn't sound disrespectful, because it's not. I'm trying to say you're a person who's up the front. Okay, so what I'm thinking is, I say you seem to get wheeled out. That's the bit that seems disrespectful. I don't mean it to be. I'm just trying to say it's almost like when the government needs or wants, or Jacinda wants a photo op or whatever. I'm wondering about how you feel when perhaps you're involved in situations when, let's say, the government or a person of profile within the government, you know, wants to have you alongside them or whatever, because you guys are speaking with one voice. What about these times when you're kind of disagreeing with what actually has happened? Have you got an opportunity to communicate this to the people who are making those decisions? Do you have enough kind of push through so you can kind of say to them, well, when we talk because we're agreeing, we also need to talk when we don't agree, and this is why? Do you get those opportunities?
So I think maybe you and others are misunderstanding both my role and actually how things play out in the media. So, you know, I write a lot, right? I put all my thoughts down. I can, you know, I can make my feelings about things known through, for example, you know, the chief science advisors. So there are lots of ways that we can get our voices to the government. So I don't sit on any official boards. You know, I don't get called by the Prime Minister, you know, to say, right, you know, give me your opinion on this. You know, in the early days of the pandemic, there were things that I helped her understand through the science, the same as I've helped other ministers, and I made that offer to all parties, right? If you want to understand the science, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
So when you see me being interviewed in the media, I'm not being put there by the government, right?
I understand
I'm there because the media, you know that I'm able to help explain what is the science behind the pandemic. And I think the thing that's really, really clear is that we can take the same science, the same evidence, and we can make different recommendations or suggestions based on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the suggestions being made by me at the beginning of the pandemic, we're very much in line with what the government were doing. And now we're changing because I have a very different idea of how I think we should be playing this living with COVID game, versus what the government is doing. It seems clear to me that they're trying to maintain sort of social cohesion. They're trying to keep hospitalizations low. I want a world where those who are immunocompromised can do the same things that everyone else is doing, and not kind of stuck at home. So I think it's, and I make my feelings really clear, right? I make them clear on social media. I write about them. So I think it's not, and it's really, I find it absolutely fascinating that people kind of think that I'm a kind of a shill for the Labour government. It's like you haven't been listening to anything I've said. You haven't read anything I've said.
I guess I wasn't trying to, that's why I was struggling for the words. I guess I wasn't trying to say you're an official spokesperson, but I guess the impression I get, and maybe this was the wrong bit, was that there are connections between you and the Prime Minister or you and the government, maybe not officially. Like you said at the start, you had some connection there. I guess what I'm asking is there a secret kind of Facebook messaging group, and what are you saying in there? Maybe that's what I'm asking. Hey, look,
as I say, I've made really clear that what I say, any advice that I'm willing to give, would give it freely to anyone. I have made that offer to the opposition leaders, and I find it really interesting that when my advice aligns with the government, I'm kind of called a shill, and when it doesn't, everybody just goes really quiet. I was one of the people who appeared at the Waitangi Tribunal against the government, and that was kept really quiet. Like nobody suddenly went, "Oh, there's Siouxsie Wiles yelling at the government for being inequitable." So it's kind of really interesting how we, as experts who become public figures, are then kind of used by people, as kind of almost like weapons. It's been, me, myself personally, I've obviously been the subject of multiple smear campaigns because somehow it's seen that being able to damage my reputation will be beneficial, right? So it's a really weird place to get caught up in, because I feel like I've been extremely transparent about where I get my evidence from, about explaining what all the data is showing and what I think we should be doing based on what I value and how I would like New Zealand to be.
Can we just finish with, and you've kind of already said this, but it'll be good to, seeing everyone always want sort of morsel bite-sized pieces of content, to really nutshell, now that we're in orange, as citizens, what should we be doing?
So, if you haven't had your vaccinated, please wear a mask certainly in the places where it's required, but actually, in other places too. Think of these public health measures as things that enable other people to do the things that you take for granted, right? Yes, it's perfectly safe for you to go to the supermarket, but it isn't safe for everyone else or for other people if you aren't wearing a mask. So kind of do those things, please. And while masking is not required in schools now, really, really encourage it, right? This is another environment where children and staff need to be. And some of those children and staff will be immunocompromised, and they need us all to wear a mask to protect them.
Siouxsie, thanks for giving us some time this morning. Really appreciate your insights. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And have an amazing, hopefully you've got some time off over Easter. You're taking a break?
I am taking a break. It'll be my first proper break in 2 years. So I am not responding to anything. I'm turning off my email. I definitely need a break. And I hope everyone else.
Do you have to wear like a big hat or dye your hair when you're trying to have a weekend off so people don't recognize you from 300 meters away?
Oh, look, I'll just stay home.
What do they call that? A staycation? Staycation this weekend?
Yep, staycation forever, basically.
Very good. Hey, Siouxsie Wiles, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for your insight.
Thanks a lot.
There you go. Now, let me just reiterate again from that conversation. I messed up my questioning. We have a benefit in the show that we're quite relaxed and chilled and laid back, and we know where we're going, but we like it to flow. The downside from that is occasionally we get caught up in questioning and it doesn't quite come out right. The question I was trying to ask Siouxsie is, based on her influence, if she disagrees with the government, does she have a chance for access? That's what I was trying to ask, which I butchered pretty badly in that conversation. So just to make sure, and make it really clear that Siouxsie's got nothing to do with the government whatsoever, and we kind of want to make that clear, because it's a misunderstanding. And I knew that, which is why it was such a poor question, because I knew that, yet it still came out like, no, so you know how you're a shit of the government, which is not the case. Anyway.
No, it's cool that we are able to give people the opportunity to sort that out, right? Whereas other outlets wouldn't be able to do that. And there is a conception that people like Siouxsie are like, being puppeted by Jacinda, and that Cindy gave her the New Zealand of the Year award and that sort of thing.
So right now, do you feel the need to apologize for being misogynist because you just used the word Cindy after our conversation earlier in the week? Should that happen? I mean, I'm just checking.
I had my tongue in my cheek, dude.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. But hang on, jokes about that. I'm not all right, we'll leave that right alone. I think Gareth says, I don't think you messed your question up. I reckon she seemed pretty tired and fed up with the whole thing. Maybe, and again, reflect that conversation we had earlier this week, answering the same questions over and over again. Maybe. All right, George, ball in your court. The show is yours, sir.
Yeah. So our last interview for today, I had a chat with Gabriel Gavin, a journalist who was actually based in Moscow until very, very recently. He's been there for 2 years, but now he's off to France to cover the election there. And we talked about basically the end of an era when it comes to space cooperation between Russia and the US, which really has been an area where those two countries have cooperated on a quite regular and full-on basis. So yeah, we'll play that out now. All right, I'm joined by the British journalist Gabriel Gavin. How are you going, Gabriel?
Yeah, very well. Thanks for having me on, George.
All good, no problem. And I wanted to get you on because, I mean, this is a story I've sort of been following as a space nerd and sort of tracking space travel news. And you wrote this for the New Statesman. Gabriel also writes for The Spectator, among other publications. But yeah, you wrote this the other day, you published this, and pretty much the jive, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the International Space Station is in jeopardy because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, actually, I think it's more than just the International Space Station. I think it's space cooperation and collaboration in and of itself, of which I think the ISS has been the big success story of the last few decades. But I think what's happened is we've had this massive and justifiable rush to introduce sanctions on all kinds of sensitive areas of the Russian economy. We've seen really effective import bans, meaning that sensitive components and other bits of machinery and other technologies can't be exported to Russia. And we know that that is working. You've seen Russia's only tank factory based in the Ural region having to shut down production because they can't get access to the components they need. And obviously that's an important boon for Ukraine, because one fewer tank that rolls off the assembly line in the Urals is one fewer tank they have to blow up when it turns up in the Donbass or outside Kiev. But at the same time, obviously, components that can be used in the manufacturing of tanks can be used in the manufacturing of, fuel tanks or rocket parts or whatever else. And for a while, we've had varying grades of sanctions that have affected these kind of things. And Dmitry Rogozin, the head of Russia's answer to NASA, Roscosmos, has for a long time railed against these sanctions and said, look, they're making it really hard for us to do our job as a space agency and for us to carry the burden of, doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the ISS. They obviously host the control room. And I think he pointed out in the past that the institute that houses the ISS control room was under Western sanctions already, despite the kind of overtures about how we need to cooperate together in space. But Rogozin, since the start of the invasion, has basically now become this kind of caricature of a Moscow official. He's led the charge talking about things like ethnicity-based weapons that would target Russians, make Russian women infertile, and make Russians allergic to their traditional food. So you can imagine, a family sitting down to a bowl of to a nice big bowl of borscht or something, and find out actually it brings them out in hives, and that would be
it's going to turn them gay or something.
Yeah, that's the devious work of the Americans, I think, is his point. And so for a man who's supposed to be leading what is probably the only area of a Russian state that collaborates and plays nicely with others, he's really gone through this transformation, and it's very hard to see how these kind of partnerships can happen. So yeah, to answer your question, the ISS, I think, is the most immediate example of that. And he said, we're pulling out of the ISS. We're going to put forward detailed proposals just last week, saying that, the days of us collaborating with the Americans and whoever else in space are pretty much over. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on in that piece for the New Statesman was actually their rhetoric has now very firmly moved past peaceful space exploration. And they're saying, well, actually, everything that we do now has to meet two tests. Is it good for our space program? And is it good for defense and the defense industry and our kind of national security infrastructure? So you see real signs that Russia could be moving towards the weaponization of space. And obviously last year or in January, I forget exactly when, you saw the testing of the anti-satellite weapon that caused consternation in the West because it sent all that debris flying out into kind of low Earth orbit and presents obviously potentially a big risk for other spacecraft. And Russia obviously denies that, says it's perfectly within our rights to do it. We just blow up an old satellite to see if this tech works. But we see Russia, and to a greater or lesser extent China, moving far more towards this kind of belligerent rhetoric and very far away from this kind of let's explore the bounds of the cosmos together as humanity rather than as nations, which is something that prevailed even during the Cold War.
Yeah. I mean, like, I'm reminded of the example of the Soyuz Apollo cooperation, which sort of like was almost the foundation for the philosophy of like cramming components together to make a space station, right? And this was a huge moment in American and Soviet cooperation in space. And I think people sort of forget that it was only, a while back, it was only the other day that Americans finally were able to get to the space station on American-powered rockets, now that SpaceX has this capacity for human flight. Because in the past, since the I think 2011 was the end of the space shuttle program. Since then, the Soyuz capsule has been sending Americans to the space station.
Yeah,
so
that's right. I think it's fair to say that actually, given that the first private mission to the ISS is imminent, was just happened, just been given the green light, etc. Actually, now is, funnily enough, the time that you see the severing of those ties that were certainly for the US really important until about 5 minutes ago. So it's an interesting time for the Russian space agency to be so out on a limb, and yet still kind of horse trading as though they have all the power and all the influence. And actually, you have Elon Musk's SpaceX and others saying, well, actually, we're here to fill the gap if you're too unreliable and too out there to be a potential partner.
Yeah, it seems to all be coming to a head at once, right? Because for a while, NASA has basically been saying that the International Space Station is on its way out and they're going to sell it to a hotel conglomerate or something like that to have space tourism. I guess what happens is that, it's a shame because it does sort of like push Russia towards militarization of space in a way. And as we know, the technology is quite similar, ICBMs and putting things in space is, sort of in the same field. I'm also reminded as well of like American sort of militarization of space with the United States Space Force as well. In this reusable robotic spacecraft that apparently was like fiddling with other people's satellites.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think this is something that we're definitely seeing across the board. China is also a player in this space with the hypersonic space-based missile, potentially orbital missiles. But I mean, the overall thing that I draw from it is that I think during the fact that this was carrying on even at the height of the Cold War, you had these huge tensions on the ground, these potential tipping points, these potential flashpoints across the continent of Europe and elsewhere, where we effectively two of the world's great superpowers were very close to nuclear war at points. But actually, you had this ability to put it aside and to come together in space, the huge amount of collaboration that has to happen, even to make sure that you can dock components together and that they're going to work hand in glove, is astonishing, even for one team to be able to do that. And then you suddenly take teams from totally different political cultures, different language barriers, different political ideologies, and you say that we're, as humanity, will go here together and we'll put aside those disagreements and we'll come together in space. And I think for a generation, that was very much the kind of ideology of spacefaring. That was why we did it, was because we were doing this for the good of humanity, not for the self-interest of our individual nations, although it obviously did have benefits indirectly. And I think that actually the closing of that chapter and the move towards militarization of space and the move towards individual countries going their own way and saying, actually, we're going to keep our tech to ourselves. We're going to focus on building our own, we're going to go and build our own international space station. It's going to be better than yours, et cetera, like China has done and like Russia appears to be doing, is I think a real signal of where diplomacy is at the moment, where relationships between states are. And I think it's fair to say that if you just purely look at space cooperation, we're in a far worse position than we were during the Cold War. And I think as a symptom of a wider disconnect, I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, during the Cold War, it was sort of almost this like state of exception, right? Where we could hang out with the other side and shoot things into space, which is strange considering the military sort of origins of space travel. And as you say, that sort of like that Carl Saganism of like, the world is this one spaceship Earth and we need to take care of it, and that sort of thing seems to be on its way out, not just in terms of the crumbling cooperation between the superpowers, but also like, did you see that clip of Jeff Bezos and what's his face, Star Trek guy?
Leonard Nimoy.
No, the one who went to space, Captain Kirk.
I've actually never seen any of these TV shows.
Why is his name escape?
I'll probably get emails.
Here we go. I got it. William Shatner. William Shatner. Right, yeah. Did you see that? Did you see that video of them when they came back from their trip to space?
Coming out the capsule, you mean?
Yeah. And William Shatner, he sort of, I should have brought it up anyway. It just sort of came to me. William Shatner, he has this sort of like Carl Sagan moment where he's like, it was beautiful, and like if only every human being could like see what I saw, there'd be peace on Earth. And Jeff Bezos is next to him with his like cowboy hat on, just sort of like looking straight through him, not sort of even paying attention to what he's saying. Like William Shatner's like nearly in tears. And then Bezos is like just sort of like interrupts him with a bottle of champagne and just starts going, like and partying and stuff. And it's like this perfect like contrast of that old school like peace on Earth, human cooperation, the final frontier, and this sort of like, I guess, newfound private spacefaring culture of the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you have kind of two choices when it comes to space. You can do it because it's exciting and because it's something that's genuinely good for humanity and it's pushing this shared frontier. It's a good in and of itself, I think. Or you can do it out of self-interest, out of a kind of, I'm going to go further than anyone else. I'm going to build the tallest building, and then I'm going to go, higher than anyone else has ever gone before. And I think that while I don't have any particular opinion about how space should be done, I think that when the private sector is involved, it tends to go more for that kind of one-upmanship than states have gone in for over the last 20 years, 30 years. Space initially, obviously, was a huge competition space. Using the word space far too often, but it was a huge area of competition, and actually that kind of the moon landing, etc., and the one-upmanship that was there, and the proprietary secret technologies, and I think actually we very quickly moved past that. And the American, probably in part because the Americans won it very early on, and they said, we've hit this milestone. You might have hit most of the others, but we can do this better than you can. Actually, it was in everyone's interests to stop competing and start working together, not least because it's cheaper. And no one wants to have to, certainly for the last kind of 30, 40, 50 years, no one wants to have to do this stuff on their own. It was too expensive. And actually only recently have you got China coming as a major player and delivering, in a position to deliver their own program. I don't think Russia is economically capable at the moment of investing the kind of money it would need to really cement its status as an international space power. I think it'll have to be laser focused on some specific defense spending and some specific technological advancements to get any return from its money. But if we're talking about, there's been talk of, I think, a Russian mission to Venus or something, and a Russian space station, etc. I just think this is all, pun intended, pie in the sky stuff, because Russia isn't in a position to deliver even the most basic infrastructure projects back on Earth. Moscow is a phenomenally well-developed city, but the rest of the country has had no spending for a very long time. And that situation's only getting worse with the sanctions because of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's sort of sad that I think people aren't even realizing this, right? That this is an end of an era, that the International Space Station is dying, not only because of a lack of cooperation between states, but also because of maybe private interests. And Elon and SpaceX are making the rockets now. He's got the contract for the mission to the moon and that sort of thing. I want to before we end, I want to sort of shift gears and get some insight from you, because you're a man of airports and flying around and that sort of thing. I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk about planes, but I want to talk about you've just been in Moscow, and now you're heading to Paris or France via your home in the UK. How was Moscow during wartime? And what are you going to be up to in France?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because actually, I don't feel like I really have a home. My home for the last nearly 2 years has been in Moscow, and I've never felt that I've been in a city that I've loved more than Moscow. I have like a profound feeling of being at home when I get there, and every time I leave, I want to go back. I think what's astonishing about it is how little and how much it changed at the same time in quite an eerie way. So just to give you a sense, I was on the day before the invasion, I was in the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is about 50 miles from the border with the Donbass, and I'd gone down with quite a few people. A Russian journalist called Sasha Chernik from the Kommersant business newspaper, and it was kind of like a jolly. Everyone was going down because it was the thing you were doing. There were tensions at the border, and you wanted to see what it felt like on the border and what people there thought, and you might see some military convoys, etc., but really no one from certainly the Moscow lobby, from Russian journalists, thought there was going to be an invasion. And from all political inclinations, from all publications, anyone who was a Moscow-based correspondent, virtually to the man and to the woman, said this is nonsense. This is, I made the case in a piece for The Spectator, embarrassingly, about 10 days before the war started, that actually the build-up was part of a Russian disinformation campaign to try and put pressure on the diplomatic negotiations that were going on.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. My American friend was like, dude, if the U.S. intelligence agency says anything, I just think the opposite usually.
Well, I remember the AP's diplomatic reporter at the State Department briefing. They said, well, he compared it to intelligence about Iraq or Kabul won't fall, etc., etc. And those were obviously failings of American intelligence or perceived failings of American intelligence. But I think this time it appears that the intelligence was spot on, astonishingly on the money, to the point where you're really flying in the face of a lot of criticism. Moscow was saying the whole time, very, very clearly, we are not going to do this. And to the point where I think it became very clear that actually even, any of the top spokespeople were out of the loop. And they would genuinely also believe, like we did, that it wasn't going to happen. So after the war started, I was woken up by warplanes flying overhead. I got a 12-hour, all the airspace was closed for civilian aircraft, so I had to get a kind of 12-hour sleeper train back up to Moscow. And for the last couple of weeks, for the couple of weeks there since the start, after the outbreak of the war, I think it was a feeling of massive uncertainty, the slow drip, drip, drip of things closing, things changing, people saying, oh, are you going to go? Are you going to leave? Are you going to stay? Are you going to come back? Particularly Russians talking among themselves as well, actually, because people who could leave and were in a position to work remotely have done so. And yeah, at the same time, things carry on, and things carry on as normal. And, if you are a young Muscovite who wants to travel a lot abroad, who spends money in international brands that are pegged to, the dollar standard or whatever, who wants to use Facebook and Instagram because you're obsessive about these things. If you're that kind of upwardly mobile, young, outward-looking Russian living in Moscow, your life has changed overnight. Of course it has, irredeemably. But for the vast majority of Russians living in regional cities, living in the provinces, who buy Russian food and buy Russian food at a Russian supermarket, they live that kind of life of autarky anyway. They're not particularly outward looking. The biggest change might be that the McDonald's has closed down. But beyond that, foreign holidays, Turkey was probably on the cards, was probably your main choice, and it still is. People weren't going for jaunts in Paris and whatever else. So when people talk, and I'm guilty of this as well, talking about the kind of shock and surprise and concern in Moscow, I think it's really worth bearing in mind that's not the full picture. So it reminds me a little bit of Brexit in the UK, where people were saying, well, how are we going to, go to France? How are we going to, hire cleaners? How are we going to do this? And you realize that actually the people who all voted for it, they weren't in that position to start with. These were concerns of a very small minority that was all uniformly on one side. So I think the mood in Russia, it entirely depends on who you speak to, what age they are. And with some people, it's business as usual. With some people, it's the end of the world. And that obviously doesn't compare even in the slightest to the feeling, across the border in Ukraine.
Yeah. What's the, so heading to France now, are we seeing sort of, I guess, the same sort of polarization there that we might have seen during, so for those of you who don't know, election coming up in France, and it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be a Le Pen Macron thing again, like last time. Is that a sort of like, is that, I guess, are there parallels to the sort of liberal centrist versus populist right wing of America, for example?
Yeah, well, I think politics in these presidential systems always feels more polarized. When you come from a kind of, good tried and tested British-derived parliamentary system, things tend to be a bit more kind of dum-de-dum-de-dum, because you don't have, rank outsiders coming in, as you did in the US, and completely upsetting the apple cart, nor do you have, people who have effectively no parliamentary grouping coming from nowhere, like you did with Macron in France last time round. I think it would be a particularly unsophisticated take for me to say that we're seeing a rise in populism across all of Europe. I think that's been true for the last kind of, 10, 15 years. And you only have to look at the re-election of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary to see that that isn't going anywhere, or the trajectory of Poland, for example, to see that that isn't going anywhere. But it's clear that Russia is going to become a part of this election. Le Pen has said, for example, that she wouldn't sanction Russian energy, and in a country where fuel prices have led to massive riots in the past, and there's risk of kind of serious unrest over living standards and the economic situation. That is potentially popular answer. And actually, this question of does European solidarity and our obligations to NATO, does that come first, or should we mind our own business and look after our own? I feel like that's a debate that's been had basically throughout history, actually. So while you do have this rise of populism, you also have these kind of long-standing trends that I think will define this election like they do every other election. But yeah, and at the same time, the collapse of Russia's standing in the world has opened up a couple of other fronts as well in places like Georgia, and where the country I came via, which is Armenia, where I was covering the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis. And you see countries that have basically pegged themselves to Russia's military might for their stability, for their self-preservation, going, oh God, what if we backed the wrong horse? What if now Russia's distracted and actually never had the force to be able to maintain order here in any way it could? So I think as Russia takes on a different role in the world, much more of a pariah, much more of a malign role in the world than it could have otherwise played, you will start to see that impacts the political situation. It becomes a much more divisive question in Europe and places like France and Germany, but also in its backyard as well. So I think this is just the start, really.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear how you go in France, and it's definitely an election that I think is, one of those ones that the world looks at, right, to sort of gauge where people are at in terms of that divide. I'll just put up your Twitter for the viewers and listeners to see. Gabriel Gavin is as I said at the start of the interview, New Statesman journalist and the Spectator and all-round journalist person, and also there's his website as well, looking very cool with the sunnies on.
I don't think I've got a single photo of me without any sunglasses on.
All right,
cool.
Cheers,
Lovely
Gabriel.
Thanks for having me on.
That was Gabriel Gavin talking about the end of an era with space cooperation between the US and Russia, and a few other things there. Very interesting to hear from someone who was in Moscow at the start of the invasion of Ukraine as well.
It is funny to sometimes feel an outsider who is at an event which the world looks at one way, and then to see how they look at it, and it's not comparable. But I was in Fiji when the last coup happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was there. I was due to leave. We were flying out on the Saturday, I think, or the Friday or the Saturday, whatever it was, and it happened on the Friday or the Saturday. And all of Fiji kind of went into a lockdown, and like there was no one on the streets, and everyone was in their homes and that kind of stuff. And I was working for a radio station at the time, and I actually phoned them internationally. Oh, it was a Saturday. Phoned them internationally, and I said, "Hey, I'm actually in Fiji with where the coup's going on right now. It looks like it could be quite bad. And the streets are shut down and people aren't on the streets, yada yada yada." And the announcer went, "What coup? No one's talking about it here." So the perspective from inside was like very different from what the world was looking at it, or even other parts of the South Pacific. It was like the third coup in 10 years or something, and it wasn't even being looked at. But being in Fiji, about to leave when it happened, it was like you could feel the tension. It's interesting having that perspective of being in a location at a time rather than outside. Yeah. So anyway, hey, before we head off, I wanted to share one thing that we talked about earlier in the week. We had a conversation when Penny was on about Brian Edwards, and you might notice that I am sharing a screen, which is a screenshot. And the reason I'm sharing a screenshot of what Brian Edwards said, which was talking about apologizing and basically supporting Will Smith and the slapping of Chris Rock, is it appears that he has now deleted it from his Facebook page. It's no longer there. So obviously something happened and he had enough nous or pushback or something that it's no longer on his Facebook page. The commentary that, I guess left-wing media commentator legend in New Zealand had about supporting the use of violence over words is now gone off his Facebook page. And we did say that we were going to keep an eye on it, but no explanation or no apology. It's interesting that he's written a piece that's called How to Make a Convincing Public Apology. He's obviously removed the post talking about supporting Will Smith, but is yet to either apologize or explain why he decided he'd share that, which is, I think, an interesting thing to still find out about. But just to wrap up something we talked about earlier the week, I thought we'd just share that as well. Anything else there, George?
No. This is something we can talk about in the future. I am excited about the plans released today from the DCC to sort of pedestrianize, well, sort of half-assed a little bit, George Street in Dunedin. And I think that's sort of maybe indicative of debates that are had in all municipalities about public transport and green strategies and all that. So maybe look out for that, viewers, in the future.
Just before we move on from that, I think the idea about pedestrianizing and making cars and like having more of a walk area for shopping over cars is lovely. I think what they're going to execute in Dunedin is going to be a fucking nightmare. And I think it's going to cause huge amount of problems and congestion areas in other parts of the city. I think it's going to cause, because at the moment, people who don't know Dunedin, George Street is sort of between the Octagon and North Dunedin, and it's 2 lanes at the moment, and people drive down there obviously in 2 lanes. That looks lovely. That's why I'm like, well, there you go. There it is. There's George Street at the moment. It looks lovely, that image you just showed before. Bring that image back up because it's really nice to look at. But what it's going to do is it's going to drive everyone over onto other streets, and I think it's going to cause some of those streets to the, what would it be? It would be the east of George Street, like King Edward and that kind of stuff, are already struggling to capacity near where the current hospital is, and I think it's just going to cause massive backlogs in other areas. So I love the idea. I really do. I think that looks amazing. But I think when it comes to current traffic flow, and I know people are going to argue, well, then what we're trying to do is get people out of cars. Yeah, that's an idea which sounds lovely, but I think it's going to be an absolute nightmare for traffic around other parts of the city, whilst actually also making a part of the city look at that. It looks lovely. Who wouldn't want to have that in the center of their city? So
yeah, for me, it sounds like a risk we ought to take.
There is another interesting part of this conversation as well, and I don't believe that you rule by mob law. In other words, you don't always just go with what the majority want, but I don't know this for sure. I didn't do my research, but my understanding is there was far more pushback against this idea from ratepayers and people within Dunedin than there was support for it. So that would be an interesting.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you shouldn't. It doesn't mean you shouldn't make. When I say progressive, I mean moving forward as opposed to the political sense of the idea. But initiatives and exciting things that people don't quite get, but it still should be a part of the conversation as well. So yeah, I mean, this could be obviously we're not a Dunedin product. We're a nationwide, if not international product. We're an international product, but this is taking this conversation to look at the idea of public transport and pedestrian spaces and what other cities are doing as well could be really interesting.
So this is definitely indicative of a global trend.
Yeah. I mean,
so there's a taster for next week, possibly.
Yeah, maybe. It's always hard to change infrastructure. And big countries like China and stuff typically are the best at basically putting infrastructure into an area where no people live, like eight lane highways each way, for example, and then allowing the city to grow up around it. Changing infrastructure to within a current city is a lot more difficult. So I didn't have any commentary on this when it was going through. But if someone had asked me, where would you vote? I would have probably voted to leave it as it is. Not because I don't like the look and the feel and the ideology of it, but I just don't know if it can be executed the way that doesn't make worse of an impact on other places. But, if it works, it'll be amazing. Let me put it this way. If it works, it'll be amazing. It'll be an amazing space.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. Otherwise, we go on for ages. We'll get an expert on maybe because, as you said, the mob knows fuck all.
Yeah, but yeah, and again, don't want to go boomeristic or something. The mob does know fuck all, but because the mob ends up paying for it, it is a part of the conversation that needs to be had as well. And I'm coming from someone who says actively, if we always run by mob rule, how do we look after the minority view? And I firmly believe in that. but it's still part of the conversation. So yeah. Now speaking of next week, obviously it's Easter weekend. So if you're still watching us live now, or you watch us on demand, we won't be here on Easter Friday. We won't be here on Easter Monday. We'll be back on Tuesday. So we're going to have a weekend off as well. In fact, George, you might not even be back Tuesday, Wednesday. You might be up in Christchurch doing some things, eh?
Yeah, maybe I'll try and phone in.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Or ask me, maybe we can do a remote one. You can do a remote. There's a new freedom camping I saw being set up in Christchurch in the last week. Maybe you can do a little bit of a
I'll get my flash new cell phone out. Yeah,
on the street with George, something like
either
that.
that or use my grandma's shitty ass Wi-Fi to beam in.
Cool, man. All right, that's us. Have a really happy and safe Easter. If you're driving this Easter, please be safe. You know, think about the idea of being half an hour later to wherever you're going versus never coming back at all. I think it's fairly obvious which is the better option. You know, if it's an overtaking maneuver that possibly you could make, but there's a 10% more increased risk, then just don't take it. You know, you'd rather be half an hour late than not at all. Take care on those roads out there wherever you are. We want to see you back here on Tuesday because there's only 4 of you already watching. So if one of you disappears, then there'll only be 3. So it's really a selfish place I'm asking this from. But no, be safe on the roads. Have a good weekend. And we will catch you next Tuesday, 11 a.m. here in Big Hairy News. I guess I got to turn this off, don't I, George? I was just thinking you took control, but I'm back in control now. All right, team. Thanks for joining in. Thanks, George. We'll see you next week. Hooroo.